Kevin, welcome to the stage.
All right. Thank you, Jillian. As you said, hopefully I stay awake for the whole 50 minutes. If not, just throw stuff at me. We're all good. Anyway, my talk is on something maybe a little bit different. It's not about the severe weather, the tornadoes, or pretty pictures of tornadoes. It's what happens after the event when we in the Weather Service have to go out and survey the tornadoes and figure out just how many there are. And that answer might be a little harder than you might expect to, the question might be a little harder to answer than you might expect. We'll do a brief review here of the surveying technologies that we at the Weather Service implement, both in the past and in what's going on now. And then we'll focus most of our time on some examples, both in terms of how this new technology is helping us to augment tracks that we already knew about, and then even find ones that we didn't know about. And then some of the findings that were coming out of the result of this. And then no good deed goes unpunished. This new technology has presented some challenges to us in the Weather Service, and we'll be focusing on those as well. So long ago in a galaxy not so far away, maybe like 5 years ago, we at the Weather Service have been doing surveys for the same that we've been doing them for decades. We did ground surveys, and that encompassed us getting damage reports through the emergency management, the public, Skywarn spotters. And if the damage was considered severe enough, we would send out a ground survey team to go map out what had happened. Sometimes we had photos of the tornado, sometimes we didn't. And so we had to determine what caused the damage sometimes. We would send out a team and they would write down a bunch of notes on lots and lots of paper, and then they'd come back and sketch out some rather crude maps of the track. If the track was considered, the tornado event was significant enough or widespread enough, we sometimes would send up a Civil Air Patrol flight to map out the damage track, and you can see an example of a Civil Air Patrol image here on the bottom of the screen. However, this type of surveying leaves much to be desired. The ground survey teams are limited by time. We only have so much staff at each Weather Service office. As you can probably attest in here in Kansas, the road network can be your limiting factor too, especially on some of those back roads. You don't want to get stuck, and this is an example of what happened to one of our cars that got stuck on a back road on a storm survey not too long ago. Staff resources, if there's going to be another severe weather event the next day, we can only devote so much in the way of staff to this, and if there's multiple tornadoes, it just compounds the problem. Civil Air Patrol flights are only reserved for the higher end events because they're rather costly and take time to do. And then even if we do a good survey and we have a lot of high resolution detail, cataloging the event up until recently was very hard to do. The GIS data was not easily shareable, and the storm data had only very basic statistics. And this is an example of storm data in its glory into what it handicaps us with. The red line, the red polygon, is the actual track of the tornado as derived via satellite imagery. And what you can access via storm data through either SPC or NCDC or NCEI is the yellow line. That's all the data you're going to be able to get from their database, because especially what the biggest handicap is you're only allowed to enter a start point and an end point for the tornado and nothing in between. So it presents some challenges, especially for complex tracks like this. And you can only enter the highest EF scale rating, whereas we all know the tornadoes vary in strength and size throughout their life. So it really handicaps us when it comes to trying to catalog these events. So what has changed over these past 5 years? We've had, of course, the proliferation of cell phones and digital cameras where everybody can take pictures of damage and tornadoes and then send them to us or upload them to social media sites instantaneously. Also in the last 5 years, we've implemented at the National Weather Service the Damage Assessment Toolkit, or the DAT, that allows us to take all this data, whether it be from ground sources, our surveys, even aerial sources, and put it into one GIS database and draw GIS-ready tracks that are accurate and precise and easily exportable and used for all of our partners. So how the DAT works is we have an app on a tablet or a smartphone, and we go out in the field and we can catalog these damage points as we go along the track of the tornado. And we can also input other sources such as satellite imagery and aerial data, which we'll cover here in a bit. And then from that we can derive tracks off of these and then export them and share them with our governmental partners such as FEMA, our county and state governments. They can also be used for research purposes. It's all free and all available to anybody who wants it. And it's also great for web stories and such. And this is an example of just some of the high resolution tracks we can create in the DAT that we can share with the public. And it's very, very cool stuff, especially considering what we were handicapped with up until very recently. Also, when we talk about improvements, we have improvements when it comes to aerial surveying. We'll talk here about the Civil Air Patrol has been around for the last 5 or 6 decades, and we've been utilizing them ever since their inception to do storm surveys for us. But now we have other eyes in the sky. The USDA has implemented a program called the National Agricultural Imagery Program, or the NAPE, that takes 1 meter resolution imagery via aerial flights across the CONUS at hopefully once a year. And if you're lucky enough and your tornado occurred before then and the damage is still visible, you can get pictures of the track, which is very, very cool stuff. And we'll show an example of just how revolutionary that can be later on. Of course, you have unmanned aerial vehicles, or drones, as people like to call them, which provide a rapidly deployable solution that you can take out on the survey team sometimes and then get up in the air and take pictures of the track right away. And there's also been improvements to the radar. Even though we're using the same radar that was deployed back in the 80s and early 90s, we've made a lot of enhancements to the radar over the last decade, starting with Super Res back in 2008, Dual Pol back in 2011, 2012, and then recently we've updated the scanning strategies of the radar so we get more frequent low-level cuts, especially with SAILS, mesosales, AVSET, all sorts of acronyms that I'm just throwing out at you. And we even have new volume coverage patterns coming out here in the next year or so that'll help improve our scanning strategies even more. Now, when it comes to satellites have been used for surveying tornadoes ever since the 90s or so. They were used for research purposes because the data was crude. It sometimes took weeks or even months to get it and process it. This is an example of one of the earliest surveys I could find using satellite imagery. Was back the Moore, Oklahoma tornado of May 3rd, 99. But it wasn't until 2011 that the National Weather Service utilized satellite imagery to augment ground surveys, and that was with the April 26, 27 super outbreak across the southeast U.S. And they utilized rather coarse imagery, 250 meter or 15 meter imagery off of the MODIS or ASTER satellites. They used a type of imagery called NDVI, which compares before and after imagery and uses the colorized differences to figure out where the tornado was. And here it shows up quite well as the blue line where the vegetation has been disturbed pretty significantly by this large tornado. But what has changed in the last 5 years is the resolution of these commercially used satellites has improved dramatically. We're talking sensor resolution of less than a half a meter. In some cases, we're talking about 2/10 or even a tenth of a meter resolution, which is astounding when you consider how far up in space you are. This resolution, this type of imagery is becoming more and more readily available through different mediums. One that you're probably all familiar with is Google Earth. And you can access historical imagery via that browser, but there's other online sources available. And even the National Weather Service has a partnership with the USGS for targeted satellite scans, if and so we request it, where a local office can relay a request to the USGS to get satellite scans of a certain area, hopefully within a couple days after an event, to document that event. This is an example of some of the imagery we can get. We took it days after the event instead of having to wait for a Civil Air Patrol flight or just keeping our fingers crossed that another satellite happened to scan the area. But there's also limitations with aerial data. Unfortunately, here in Kansas, we have a lot of grassland, which doesn't show tracks very well. Non-vegetative areas are also problematic. And when it comes to tree cover, trees will show you larger tornadoes, but they may not show smaller tornadoes, and they can not always behave properly in the winds, and they might not show these smaller circulations. There's also a cost factor involved. It takes time and money to position the satellite, to take an aerial flight, and to process all this data. And then even with all this new technology, we still can't fully assess the strength of a tornado via aerial surveying. We can get pretty close, but you still can't figure out what the structure was, what the quality of the structure was, how strong was it, how well built was it. We still can't do that via aerial surveying means. We still have to be on the ground and take a close look as to what that structure was. And so even though satellites and UAVs each have their strengths and weaknesses. Satellites, of course, cover very large areas. They can have high detail, as I talked about earlier, and the data is immediately GIS ready, and we can import it right into the DAT and draw tracks right on top of it. But there's some fairly significant handicaps, especially when it comes to cloud cover and satellite availability. There's times that you might not get a satellite scrambled over the area for weeks. And even if you do get it over the area and you happen to have clouds, you're kind of a SOL, essentially. So there's also a time lag when it comes to getting the data. you're not going to have the data immediately after the event the next day for your ground survey. You can get it maybe a week after the event. That's probably your best case scenario. UAVs, on the other hand, provide that real-time data right away. You can take it up when it's not dependent on clouds, but there's other limitations as well. They cover a relatively small area, and you're handicapped, of course, if it's too windy, which often happens after a severe weather event. You get the winds on the backside. Battery life is a limitation. You have to worry about training your staff to be able to fly these drones. And of course, there's the privacy issues, which I'm sure we're all familiar with and have heard about, that we're still trying to assess at the Weather Service. So now we'll focus on some examples here of different events that when I was working at the Des Moines office for the last 5 years, these are some of these case studies of where we were able to improve tornado tracks using aerial data. And this is a classic supercell case. It's a pretty slam dunk event. A beautiful supercell tornado. The original track is highlighted there in the red line that the ground survey team found the next day after the event. And then we were able to acquire a satellite scan about 3 days later, and we were able to see that the tornado started much sooner than we had anticipated. And in fact, we added a full 33% more track length onto it, so we were able to lengthen the track by approximately a third of what the original survey was, which is pretty outstanding. Considering we had all these pictures of the tornado, we still weren't able to find the whole track via the ground survey. And you can see the track showing up there on the bottom left side, that thin line that I have highlighted in the aerials. That's the track that we didn't see in the ground survey. Social media has also been a gold mine for us when it comes to this data. In terms of even trying to figure out where the tornado was, we oftentimes try to do photo triangulation, using multiple photos at the same time and trying to hone in on where the tornado was. This is a great example of where that came to our aid, where we had the original ground survey for this tornado. This was a landspout tornado, so the radar depiction wasn't that great back in August 2015. And the original survey track is at the bottom. But when we were looking through all the social media images on Facebook and Twitter, we were able to triangulate where those pictures were taken and the orientation they were taken and the direction they were taken, and hone in and immediately realize that the start point for that tornado was not where we had the start point at the ground survey. And you can see it's offset by about 2 to 3 miles north of the original ground survey. And so after that, I took my own personal drone. We don't have drones in the Weather Service quite yet. And went and flew the track and to see where exactly the start point was. And you can see some of the aerial imagery taken there with the drone on the left side of the screen, and you can see especially on the bottom image, that was an area that the ground survey team couldn't see. It was a soybean field and wasn't easily observed from the ground. So when we got up in the drone, it was pretty clear cut what had happened, and the track was much longer than we anticipated. And that track actually was imaged by the NAPE program about 3 weeks later, and one of the images there on the right-hand side is an example from that survey. So when it was all said and done, the original track you'll see there in the red, and the final track derived off of the aerial imagery is in the blue and green polygons. And you can see just how much we were able to add to the track. We got the bulk of the tornado in the original ground survey, but it was the beginning and end points that we struggled with, and that you'll see that time and time again with these tornadoes. And we actually added a full the tornado track after we adjusted it was twice as long as the original ground survey. And we were able to add on another about 13 minutes to the tornado time on the ground, which is significant if you're trying to do research, trying to correlate radar data to what's going on at the ground. From a research standpoint, so this is really big stuff because you want to know exactly what's going on at the ground during that radar scan time. Going on to QLCS events, one of my favorite type of storm mode. Oftentimes you never see these tornadoes. They're rain-wrapped, and they go at 50 to 60 miles an hour, and they're here and gone before you know it. This is an example of a QLCS event in western Iowa back in 2014. You can see the mesovortex there on the left two radar images, and it was rotating. We had a tornado on the ground. It was an EF2, but what happened was there was a second tornado that took over the path of the original tornado that we couldn't tell from the ground survey because it happened over a farm field, and you're not driving through a farm field in your truck. So you wouldn't see the fact that the original tornado had turned into a downburst, had winded out, and the second tornado had taken over. So the fine detail you can pick up even with these QLCS events through farm fields. And later on in that event, the system put down a second tornado, and you can see the tornado track shows it very well there. That's not ground scouring, that's just crop debris being realigned with the vortex. and the radar imagery was not all that impressive. You can see it's just a couple of pixels gate to gate for velocity. And my mic go out? Okay. Okay. And so what happened here, what you can see in this image is that the winds on the right flank of the vortex were quite sustained and actually probably caused more damage than the vortex itself. So when you're on the ground trying to determine what happened, what type of wind happened, you might think you had straight line wind damage here, when in fact you can see the tornado sitting on the very right, on the west side of that wind field. So something to keep in mind when you're out storm surveying is you might have linear winds, straight line winds with your tornado, but you might cause more damage than the tornado itself. And this did put up a tornadic debris signature. I have it highlighted there in the white circle there on the bottom left image. It was very, very faint, but thankfully it was close to the radar and we were able to pick it up. On June 12, 2013, we were able to utilize all sorts of different mediums to try to catalog a rather substantial tornado outbreak across northern Iowa. I say outbreak, it was 7 tornadoes, but they all occurred in one storm in 45 minutes. And the radar imagery was very unimpressive. It was a landspot event, so everything was below the radar beam, so we had nothing to go off of when it came to looking at radar data to figure out what had happened. So we utilized social media imagery from, again, Facebook and Twitter. We had a local TV crew with a drone. We were able to take that up and survey parts of the track, and you can see some of the imagery there. And we also ordered satellite imagery for the first time. This was the very first time that the Weather Service utilized satellite imagery from that USGS acquisition program, and we at the Weather Service in Des Moines were able to tap that. We were the first event to do that, and we were able to show the results of just how powerful it could be. The original ground survey there is actually highlighted in the red dotted line, so you can see what we were able to change when we took into account the new social media aspect and the aerial surveying tools at our disposal to create the best tracks possible. And here's some close-ups of some of the imagery. This might be a little hard to see. It's a black and white imagery that I've enhanced. But this is an area where 2 tornado paths actually cross. You can see the old tornado, the roping out tornado, in the highlighted by the yellow arrows, coming out of the northwest and going southeast across that grass airstrip. And then a new tornado showing up by some very, very faint cyclonic markings in the fields, moving from southwest to west-southwest to east-northeast, crossing the path about, actually that was the new tornado, what occurred before the old tornado actually went across it. So that was pretty cool to see. We also were able to pick out anticyclonic striations in the fields. This was another tornado that occurred behind the event. It was on the where you actually might expect an anticyclonic tornado to be if you were thinking of a supercell. But the tornado moved from northwest to southeast, and the striations in the field were oriented as such that you could see that it was anticyclonic in nature. So that was pretty, again, cool to see, and we were able to document this as best we could for future research. Now when it comes to finding new tracks, this is where we've run into all sorts of fun at the Weather Service, is to try to figure out what's going on with these tracks. This was a QLCS event. This is a picture just off of Google Earth. And this is a track that I found in a field up in central Iowa back after a QLCS on June 7, 2015. And the overall track is only less than half a kilometer long. And it's very short, very narrow. It didn't hit anything. But it was in the right spot on the storm. If you know your QLCS structures, it was in the shear dominant portion of the line where you would expect a tornado to be. And sure enough, it put up actually a tornadic debris signature, a very, very, very faint one. And there wasn't even a couplet with it, but it did throw up enough debris to be picked up in the correlation coefficient product. Another example from later on in that event, if anybody can see the track there, it's very, very faint. And it's very, very small. Anybody see it? It's right there. It's about 5 meters wide. It was the damage through that cornfield. It's very, very young corn. But that's the center line of the vortex, and we could pick out inflow winds on the south side, again, like that other example I showed from a couple slides ago. But it actually managed to hit a farmhouse and destroyed a grain bin. But it was a very, very, very small tornado. This was an example from July 11th, 2011. This is before dual pole. We didn't have any good radar data. But when we mapped out the tracks after this one, it was just a multi-cell cluster, and we found 12 tracks, all in this 10 by 10 miles square area. And we never quite could figure out what happened. It was in the middle of the night, and we never quite understood it. But these are some pictures of the tracks. And you can see on the top right one, there's 2 of them side by side within, like I said, probably 100 yards of each other, if that, maybe 50. So some amazing things. We never explained what happened with this event, but it was kind of cool. We've utilized other examples. This was a multi-cell tornado event that went through south central Iowa, and we were able to find the video on YouTube. We had no other reports of this tornado except a YouTube video that showed it going across the field. And we happened to get another satellite scan from an earlier event that happened to cover this area. And sure enough, you can see the track going from left to right across the screen. Very, very, very faint striations because the tornado was moving so fast. And yet we were able to draw a very accurate path for this relatively unknown tornado. Another example from a QLCS event, just showing the high resolution imagery we can now get. This is just from October of this past year in eastern Iowa. And the main image in the background is the very beginning of the tornado, the very incipient stages of the tornado genesis that you could pick up in the field. And it's very hard to see, but you can see this slight disturbance in the crops on the right-hand side of those arrows moving from southwest to northeast. So the possibilities for research and trying to figure out the fall patterns of these crops is really, really exciting. You can see later on it actually became a little more established of a path as it went through these farm fields. So this is an event from October of 2015. If I showed this to you guys and you looked at this imagery, you'd probably think this storm was nothing. And when we were watching the storm in real time, we thought it was nothing. The velocity signature was rather garbagey. There was some broad circulations in the line. It was a QLCS type setup. But overall, we didn't see anything that looked like a tornado in velocity data. But when we went over to the correlation coefficient data, you'll notice every now and then you'll see some areas of depressed correlation coefficient there on the back side of the line on the upper half of the line. And that caught my attention very, very quickly because the research I've been doing said that if you get those along the convergence zones of QLCSs, you got a tornado there. And so we didn't have a good velocity signature, but we were getting all these correlation coefficient plumes shooting up on the back side of the line. So the next day I took the drone out to western Iowa to figure out what had happened. And there were tracks all over the place. This is an example of one of them in Carroll County, Iowa. The TDS height there on the top right of the screen went up to 14,000 feet, which is nothing to sneeze at. If you think of, if you've ever looked at some of the TDS research out there, that should say you have an EF2, EF3 tornado. But this thing was incredibly weak. It went by a house and flipped a shed, and we rated it EF0, sorry. But it stayed mostly in cornfields. There's the damage we had off of it. It took apart a shed. It was moving probably about 50 to 60 miles per hour, so it was moving very, very fast and was over this residence for probably a couple seconds. We also took satellite imagery of the event. They let me ask for satellite imagery, and I utilized it as best I could. This is one of the tracks that I picked up in satellite imagery. Again, very, very narrow. The track is shown up there. You can see an insert there on the bottom right. The little specks you see there are hay bales, and the track is about as wide as one of those hay bales. So trying to pick that up in a ground survey and trying to figure out what's going on would be basically impossible. And I never could find this one on a ground survey because it was just sat out in the fields the whole time. And so from a research standpoint, again, this is very exciting because now we can correlate what truly is happening on the ground with what we're seeing on radar data and make progress on how we are to deal with these type of setups when we see them on radar the next time. And the path length of this one went on for almost 3 kilometers. And this was the granddaddy event that we call it. This was August 31st, 2014. A big HP supercell merged up with a broken line of convection and formed into a very powerful bow echo that moved across Iowa. The radar signatures certainly showed very strong winds and some mesovortices with the line, and we did have a couple tornado warnings issued. But after the event, we heard nothing. We heard about some wind damage, and we didn't hear anything that said we had tornadoes. So in the days after the event, we wrote it off, said it was a wind event, and moved on. But then we got the imagery from the NAPE program in 2015, and the results were astounding. We found track after track after track, and these are some examples of the imagery that we found. If I showed the image on the left side to all of you, I think all of you would agree that was a tornado based on the intensity of the damage. If I go and show the images on the right side, there's a little more ambiguity as to what happened, especially as you go to that bottom right one that is very broad and kind of looks like a series of downbursts rather than a tornado. Here are some other examples of tracks. The one on the top is one of my favorites because it's incredibly narrow. It's about probably 10 to 15 meters wide, but went on for 8 kilometers. And just went chewing through fields. It stayed out in soybean and cornfields. But it kept going and going and going like the little Energizer bunny. It just wouldn't stop. There were ones that were very narrow, but we couldn't even tell if they were convergent, like the one on the bottom right. So we tried to develop a classification system after the event to figure out what had happened. We didn't think all of these were tornadoes. We thought some of them were more akin to gustnadoes. And we labeled these actually as mesovortices to be a little more inclusive for a term. But afterwards, we developed a scale that took into account radar signatures, the type of damage, the length of the track, and a number of other variables. And when all was said and done, this is what we came up with. We had 111 damage paths, circulation paths, with this one event. And 111 tornadoes is a pretty significant tornado outbreak. I think if I told that to you guys, your jaws would drop. But when we cataloged them and threw them and moved and analyzed them through that scale, we decided there were 35 tornadoes. And even then, 35 tornadoes would be the single greatest tornado outbreak in Iowa history, and no one knows about it. Think about that. The old record was 28. So this kind of blew our minds as to what exactly had happened. We knew we'd had something, but this was incredible, and we're still trying to figure out what to do with this. This is not in the record books and storm data, by the way. You won't find this one in there. We're still trying to figure out what happened. We're still working with people up in the headquarters with this. So the data has brought about a number of challenges and also tried to further our research in certain areas. And one of the bigger ones has been, as I showed earlier, QLCS tornadoes. They're kind of the ugly stepchild of your supercell tornadoes. No one sees them, and they're very short-lived, and they cause relatively small little damage. But some of the things we've been finding with these QLCS tornadoes has been contradicting some of the research that's out there. The first and foremost being that the tornadoes are coming out of these mesovortices that are roughly like your parent supercell mesocyclones. And there's been a number of different theories for how they form through vortex line tilting, but based on some of the aerial data we've seen tornadoes without these mesovortices. And they've been very small, like this one on the top left. Your tornado is a single super resolution couplet, gate-to-gate couplet, and that is it. There is nothing else on the line to show you that the tornado is there, besides a TDS on the backside, which is even masked by some inflow. So it brings the question, what caused this tornado to form? There were some old theories back in the 90s about shear instability. That's the theory I'm leaning towards what was going on in this event that was causing these tornadoes to form. There's also been tornadic debris signatures. As I alluded to earlier, we've seen debris being lofted up without couplets. And that violates some of the TDS research that's out there. It says, thou shalt have a couplet with a lower in the CC to be a TDS. And we've been finding out that's not exactly true. So all the previous studies here that I have listed, and I just chose 4 of them here, all of them use product-based thresholds. They use a certain lower upper bound of the correlation coefficient. They use certain reflectivity criteria, and they all require the presence of a couplet. So what we developed, this is an example from August 31st, actually. If I showed you this, all of these are tornadoes. All of these have TDSs, or debris being lofted up, but 5 of the 12 TDSs that I found did not have a couplet with them. So almost half. And that causes some issues for those in the research community trying to figure out what's going on. So we proposed a behavioral approach to assessing whether or not you have a tornadic debris signature. Don't just look at CC and see a lowering and automatically call it a tornado. That doesn't always work, and we've seen actually false TDSs with inflow regions into supercells and in the squall lines and hail cores falling very near the circulation where people see the lowering in the CC and automatically call it a tornado. That's not always the case. So we look for the behavioral trends of the CC signature, starting on the lowest tilt at a very concentrated form and spreading outwards with time. Again, like a plume, like a debris plume, like a smoke plume that you might see on any windy day here in Kansas. And we also include convergent zones in addition to couplets. We're looking for these signatures because I think we all know that tornadoes can form, and there's times the radar can't see tornadoes forming or tornadoes existing for various reasons, whether it be the beam characteristics or for whatever reason the tornado is underneath the beam. So including convergence zones will help pick out these CC depressions, these CC plumes as we've called them, to help see what's going on. And here's just a smattering of other events that didn't exactly fit the criteria for the TDSs, but they fit our CC plume terminology. The one on the top left is one of my favorites because it's a landspout case and there's no precipitation near it. And all of a sudden you see a jump in the reflectivity, that very small spike in the reflectivity, in addition to a lower CC area, and that's your tornado. And we had probably 5 to 10 different angles of this tornado because it touched down right next to Interstate 80. So we had lots and lots of people taking pictures of this one. So we knew exactly where it was. And some other examples here from QLCS and high shear low CAPE events where they've come into play where you just don't see the couplets all the times. So some commonalities with these events. As you've probably noticed, cornfields are your best friend for finding these tracks. And unfortunately, we don't have that many here in Kansas, but we had a lot of them in Iowa. So I kind of went nuts up there in Iowa trying to find these tracks. As I showed with some other events, you can sometimes have linear winds next to the vortex that cause more damage than the vortex, and you may not see the vortex in the ground survey, but when you get up in the air, you can see it. With these QLCS, with these CC plumes, they can be very hard to verify, especially when you don't have the right ground cover. And so I've seen some studies that have tried to disprove these, but using ground cover that's not adequate. So if you have the right land cover and you have the right aerial surveying methods, I've had a very, very good, almost 100% success rate verifying these CC plumes. And trees, you might think trees would be easy to verify off of, but for these really small circulations, again, like the width of this platform, trees might not cut it. You might be the width of 1 or 2 trees. And this picture up here on the top right is a really great example where this tornado went right down a row of pine trees at a nursery and demolished one side of them. And you can see the ones on the left side are just on the other side of the road, and they're untouched. So it was an incredibly narrow tornado that went through that area. So now the last part, the opening Pandora's box, which is one of my favorite sections because it gets people thinking. I've asked many people, when I show them, especially August 31st, I ask them, were these all tornadoes? And a lot of them say, oh, they're just too small to be tornadoes. They can't be tornadoes. Nah, they just kind of write it off. But yet when we pull up storm data, and we all know storm data is perfect and has no flaws whatsoever, I pull up some of the path length, width, and EF rating statistics here for all events from 1950 to 2015. And over 60% of them are less than a mile long. And almost a quarter of them, over a quarter of them, are less than a tenth of a mile long. And almost half of them are less than 30 yards wide, and the vast majority are less than EF1 or less in intensity. So a lot of these tracks that I'm finding are meeting these criteria. So what's going on with storm data? Is storm data wrong? Are these tracks just magically not tornadoes? This is my wordy slide, but this is the official Weather Service directive for what we call a tornado and how we should document it. And everything is saying we should document these in terms of using the right technology, even if the evidence isn't completely 100% sure that we had a tornado, we should document it. And even if it does no damage, we're obliged to document it. The only thing that's up for debate are the tornadoes. And all of them are usually, when they're up for debate, it means that they're in the rain, we've never seen them, we don't have pictures of the tornado, but they're leaving the ground markings that storm data says the directives say we should count as a tornado. So we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place when you want to document these types of events. There's the warning philosophy challenge. If I issued 10 tornado warnings on the August 31st event, this is the example here using some hypothetical warning polygons, and I drew up rather conservative QLCS tornado warning polygons. I'm sure we've all seen some mighty large tornado warnings off of some QLCSs over the course of the years. The total area impacted by the tornadoes, just what we call the tornadoes, would be less than 0.25% of the total warning polygon area. So, and these are tornadoes we never heard of. The public never reported them. The news media never reported them. So in the eyes of the public and the eyes of our partners, this would be 10 missed tornado warnings. Even though it looks like we did a great job, these would be 10 misses in the eyes of the public. So what do we do in that situation? Do we issue severe thunderstorm warnings instead? Do we issue tornado warnings even though we know these things are going to be very weak and the impacts are going to be akin to severe thunderstorms? With these type of events, do we want people hunkering down in their basements fearing for their lives for what they would usually do for a tornado warning versus a severe thunderstorm warning where the call to action statements are get inside, stay away from windows, which if you did this for these tornadoes, you would have been safe. So we're stuck between a rock and a hard place there, very much so. So what have we found? We're certainly resolving the lower bound of what we call a tornado. Some of these have winds that arguably are less than what we classify as EF0, probably in the neighborhood of 30 to 40 to 50 miles an hour, which is less than what we call an EF0. There's questions that if are they all tornadoes? Do they all fit the criteria of a funnel attached to the cloud? Without a ground radar right in front of a QLCS, which I'd be loving to get someday, but it's going to be tough, it's going to be hard to justify that they aren't attached to cloud base. But they still put forecasters in a bind because even though 99.9% of these tornadoes are going to stay out in the fields and they're not going to impact anything, it just takes the one to go through that town and kill someone, and you always regret it. And that happened to us back in 2015 in Iowa. We had a tornado go through the town of Knoxville. It was a tiny little QLCS tornado, probably 50 yards wide, maybe less than that. And then the governor calls us out the next day and says we need to improve our warning system. That's tough to swallow. So we get put in a bind with this type of situation. What it boils down to make progress on this in the Weather Service is probably to change what we call a tornado for verification purposes. Do we need to be warning for all these EF0s? That's the question that we need to answer. I don't have the answer for that, but the time and time again when we try and fix what's going on, try to say, maybe in situations when we know that these tornadoes are going to be weak, do we just issue severe thunderstorm warnings instead? That's a question that's been thrown around recently, and now we have the evidence to back it up. We need a consistent approach to the warning for these tornadoes. I'm sure all of you have seen CWA borders with the polygons, and why is one office issuing one warning? Why is this other office issuing the other warning? We need a consistent approach to deal with these, because right now there isn't really a set policy. Storm data needs to be improved with the GIS capabilities, and that's hopefully coming sometime. And also a standardized policy as to what we put in the storm data for verification, for documentation purposes. So to wrap up here, this is my last slide. Improvements are only going to continue with aerial surveying. We're only going to find more of these tracks. We're only going to be able to document them with higher degrees of accuracy. The on-demand satellite acquisition program is scheduled to continue. The UAV costs are decreasing, and NOAA is looking into using them for meteorological purposes, including storm surveying, so that may be down the line at some point. But there's improvements that need to be made, especially in areas of poor land cover, so we don't suddenly have all these tornadoes in Iowa because they have cornfields, and not in Kansas where it's all grass and we can't find them, even though they might exist. So when it comes to storm surveying still, aerial surveying is not the end-all be-all, but we need a blend of accurate ground and aerial sources to get the best track, and hopefully we can answer some of these questions that they're digging up here in the near future. And with that, I will take any questions. I'm done.